Good afternoon. Welcome to Robots and Red Tape. I am your host, Nick Shutt. Lucky to have the wonderful Dr. Heather Frase with us here today. Heather, how you doing? Thank you for coming.
Oh, I'm doing really well. Thank you for having me. This is a thrill.
Oh, it's a thrill for me as well. I'm really excited to have this conversation. Before we dig into it and talk all about, cultural biases that have been built into AI and what that means and how to counter that and work with that and work around that, I'd really love it if you gave, the audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and kind of how you got here.
I on some level, I'm a lot like other people who've come into AI. I've come in sideways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That seems to be the thing right now because it's I feel
Mm.
like if you were to have taken all the perfect classes to be in AI, like in school and things like that, it was just luck because nobody really knew.
Yeah. And actually, and we also see that we need actually a wide variety of people with trainings to do AI and
Hmm.
to fill in all the AI roles needed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So actually have a background in experimental scientist in science. I got my PhD doing experimental research in material science. Uh, was very physics oriented. I always think of myself in part more of a physicist than material scientist.
Hmm.
That being said, I did not have a desire to have a career doing experimental research. Yeah,
Why not?
so why not?
Yeah.
Because vacuum pumps hate me or I hate them. They're really messy.
Hmm.
I don't know how many times I've had to clean up grease from a vacuum pump. I
Hmm.
just hate it.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's kind of a deal breaker then. So
yeah.
started in you got your PhD in material sciences and in experimental physics. What was that journey like and how did you go from being a science like an experimental
Mm.
physicist and a science and a material scientist to a data and AI professional?
So the first jump was actually into supporting the Department of Defense.
Hmm.
And I went to the Institute for Defense Analyses,
Hmm.
and there I supported the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation.
Hmm.
And they actually, it's a highly technical role. And so they like people with a technical background. And they also tend to have projects that go on for a very long time.
Nature of FFRDC research, right?
Well, the nature of military acquisition and
Mm.
military testing, I supported the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation there.
Hmm.
And those projects would run sometimes up to 10 years.
Hmm. Okay.
So, yeah, they wanted people who were kind of, they tended to hire people with PhDs because they want people who kind of like thought on that time scale, who did
Mhm.
planning on that time scale. Uh, not every effort I worked on went 10 years. Some were shorter, maybe just a couple years, but they tended to still be fairly long.
Yeah.
Uh, so that was really interesting work. The Director of Operational Test and Evaluation, it's an agency in the Department of Defense that a lot of people haven't heard of.
Mhm.
It's a little different. It actually has an oversight role.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was started by Congress when Congress found out that basically, um, military and its industry partners weren't being very forthright about what testing results were showing about military systems. And
Interesting.
I don't know, some of your watchers or listeners may have heard of the Pentagon Papers.
Mhm.
That kind of that whole event is what started the Director of Operational Testing and Evaluation.
Mhm.
So it's an oversight role. They're an independent organization within the Department of Defense. They kind of make sure that the testing programs for major military systems that are being acquired, that they're adequate testing, that they're looking at the right things, and then they oversee the testing, gather the data, independently analyze it.
Mhm.
So that was really a lot of training and just sort of like how do you test?
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
people may not know it, but there is. testing science that's out there, how to do a good test, how to do test design, how to test so that you know, so you can interpret the results, so you can get enough data. That has been around for a long time. So that, I mean, that was very interesting and very influential in sort of like how I approach things.
Mhm.
But at
Okay.
some point, you need to do something different. And so then I jumped off and started doing data analytics, machine learning, and AI. And I worked for a variety of federal customers, federal agencies.
Mhm.
So I largely analyze financial data.
Interesting. Oh,
Yeah, I looked for money laundering and financial criminal activities.
okay. Okay. So was this because I know is it FinCEN has a
Yeah.
lot of that, or is that one of the folks you were working with?
Yeah, I worked for FinCEN 4 to 5 years, and so I actually am a certified anti-money laundering professional,
There we go.
uh, and it is very interesting data,
Mhm.
and it's just very interesting to see, like, all the things, and all the processes our financial institutions have in place to try to um, keep, you know, keep the financial structure and the system safe from
Mhm.
misuse, and then all the things they do to keep us so that we can safely use the financial system.
Mhm.
Uh, it's very complex and
It's
interesting.
I
Yeah,
I I bet it is, especially when you start analyzing finances at at a macro scale and started looking for trends. And it's yeah, I always find it interesting
mm,
to look at how certain financial organizations just have, let's say, a less than stellar reputation, and how they're able to kind of get away with it, and how you work through that, and how like there are different places where you can go to move things. It's just, I just find it all fascinating.
yeah,
Um,
it,
Countering it is fascinating, and it requires a concerted effort, I would assume, at an international scale, with a lot of different bodies working together, considering the amount of data. And also, were you how were you using technology to kind of help move that along at that time?
so at that point, I was supporting like identifying typical behaviors and also identifying people specific into entities that were doing things. So
Hmm.
it was a lot of data mining, a lot of machine learning and AI came in usually in cleaning up the data,
Hmm. Hmm.
very messy data. So that is sort of kind of where the technology was. It was trying to do the bulk processing was where I was.
Okay, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you did that for a while, and now now you're now you're on your own, right? You have your own
On
company.
my own. But yeah, I did a bit of jump in between that work and now, or I'm continuing now, but that's more kind of combining the testing
Mhm.
with the AI building. It's like going into how do we assess and test AI to know what we're getting,
Mhm.
to make sure it's operating at the appropriate quality, safety, security, and trustworthiness.
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
that goes a little bit into policy sometimes,
Yeah,
so it's
absolutely.
yeah.
It's fascinating. No, and and with that, with your background
Mhm.
in operational testing across a lot of different areas, how do you use that, and how does that inform your, just kind of your approach overall, to assessing AI systems at large?
Yeah, so there's, I think, a couple of key things. One is that because I did operational testing, we really focus on how does the system operate in the expected end use conditions with
Mhm.
the expected users. And for military systems, you always talk about what missions does it do and can't do the missions. Now, really, all our systems, if you kind of look at, we have missions. Our phone has a task, a
Mhm.
mission, and actually has more than one, right? Right?
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
it's not just for calls and anymore. Actually, I don't think we use it for calls much more anyway.
No.
But it has all these tasks that they're supposed to form, and how well does it actually perform that with the expected range of users.
Mhm.
Um, so that's a big one is when I think about assessing AI, I don't want to just think at what the model level. What does the one little AI system do? It's more like how does that AI, when combined with all the other things it needs to integrate with, how does the full AI enabled system operate? And how does it operate doing the tasks we want to do with the expected users in the
Mhm.
expected condition? So it makes me sort of have a very holistic view of the system.
Okay. Can you give me some examples of that, or anyone in particular?
Well, I can think of examples where it goes wrong or where people don't take.
I love
So,
these. Okay.
so that's the other place where like my kind of operational testing comes into
Mhm.
play is that um, I often say boil it down to operational testing is look at typical conditions, look at sort of like your edge conditions, and look at known problems. So if you're going to test known problems, you need to have a collection of known problems, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
You have to know the problems in order to know what to test for. So I do tend to like to be involved in AI incident collections. That's one of the things I also do. You
Mhm.
know, I have to know the problems. So let's collect them.
Absolutely. 100%.
Right. So I I'm associated with the AI incident database, and there's an incident there that I think really shows how you need to think about the operational end use conditions.
Mhm.
There was this system for detecting guns, right? It had been used successfully in like big sports venues, and they liked it because people could just walk around, quite nice, didn't impede flow, and they could do gun detection. They sold it to a school system in North Carolina, and they deployed it in the schools, and it was a mess. False
Mm.
alarms going off everywhere. And then false, because the when you have a alarm go off or a false detection, good, false or good, the protocol was to do a manual scanning. So with all these false detections, there was this big line for manual scanning. School people weren't entering the school. It was a big mess. What we have here is they probably just said it works well in arenas. Oh, we can do it in schools, but what people take into schools is very different.
Mhm. Yeah.
So they're getting a lot of false detections because they didn't test or optimize the system then to work in the operational condition of the school versus the sports arena.
Interesting. And I assume that they weren't having that problem with false detections in the sports arenas?
Correct.
Okay. How would you approach something like that? Would they, would you want to feed the school, like, would you want to feed the AI model a bunch of, I don't know, recorded footage of security footage in schools and like have it learn? Or, I mean, how do you go about recalibrating something like that?
So I think, if I were the operational tester, first thing, if you're just doing the operational test, then what you want to basically do is you don't want to deploy it before you test it, first of all. um,
Hmm.
and you want to kind of stop and figure out what you see is like the typical things kids bring into school, and then maybe things that are less common
Hmm.
but do show up, like some weird art projects
Hmm.
might also be interesting. um, and it would basically, you would start by understanding what are the typical student that comes through, and then what are the edge cases. And you would
Hmm.
actually design tests and scenarios to run kids through the detectors and see if you get false alarms.
Hmm.
Now, here's one of the other things about operational testing is it's actually kind of expensive.
Okay.
It's resource intensive.
Hmm.
So you don't necessarily want to do all of your understanding of a system in operational testing.
Hmm.
You kind of want to look at what do I expect from performance operational testing, and then feed it back to earlier types of testing.
Hmm.
So then there would be a process of figuring out how could I maybe do some earlier testing that would, one, ensure my operational testing ran smoothly,
Mhm.
and two, reduce the size so I didn't have to repeat some of my testing.
Okay. Absolutely.
So you would probably start by gathering some, however they gather data for gun detection for the sports venues, you would do something similar, but with kid backpacks and
Right.
kid backpack contents, and then you would see how parts of your system performed, and then roll them together for performance, and finally like a operational testing graduation.
Mhm. No, that's really interesting, and it especially as you start looking at taking technology that works in one setting and moving it to another. Super interesting. It's one of those things
Yeah.
that I'm sure the people at this company and like I also would be like, of course that's going to work. Yeah, it works here. It should work over here, but that clearly that's not the case, right? Uh,
Yeah.
but and then with I mean with all your background at IDA and in DoD at large, and I'm sure you can't talk about all the stuff you did, but how, and like as we're also thinking about like different use cases for AI and different AI deployments,
Mhm.
how do you foresee AI, working at an operational level in the military and in DoD at large? And how do you also see it transforming like the day-to-day experience for the
Oh,
soldier on the ground?
yeah. Um, so I think that kind of depends on how wide of a lens you want to take to look at things. Like when we talk about the soldier on the ground, probably most people are thinking about like offensive weapons,
Mhm,
right? But when I think about weapon systems, and it's actually a lot broader. It's the offensive weapons, is your defensive capabilities, is your strategic planning. But if I make that even bigger, and I want to think about effective military operations, I start including a whole bunch of things that probably most people don't think about.
mhm,
Most people don't probably realize that the military has like a counterpart, an organization or agency that does pretty much the same things we run into on everyday life. I mean, they have hospitals, they have schools, they have utility programs, they have, major distribution networks, they even have retail stores they run, right?
mhm,
So if something's going, and those are all needed so that soldiers can go and deploy and operate safely.
mhm,
If we think about like how AI could impact this big range of systems, it's pretty large because we've already talking about we expect AI to impact our life in multiple aspects. Now, if we scope down to just sort of like maybe the offensive weapons,
mhm,
um, even that uh, is a hard question to answer, mostly because people think of AI as different things.
mhm,
Some people think of AI just as general AI systems that are like sentient,
mhm.
right? But those don't even exist.
Right. Absolutely.
Sometimes people think it's always, even at the other extreme, anything that's automated or autonomous is AI. And a lot of times that's used a lot. Other people, it may be AI is the classical machine learning or
Mhm,
AI algorithms that have been around for decades. Now, autonomous systems and systems that have this classical machine learning AI, those have been a part of weapon systems for a long time.
mhm,
And that's not going to change. But also, they're just a small part of weapon systems. They're very common, but they're just a small part. So even as we start integrating more sophisticated AI, there's still just going to be a small part.
mhm,
Uh, they could still be transformative, but I think how transformative and how quickly we have the transformation depends upon our society's appetite for risk.
Mhm,
A lot of these systems, how they perform has an element of unpredictability with it. Like if you look at our chat bots, right?
mhm,
There's always this chance they're going to do something kind of irregular and that we don't want.
mhm. Yeah, hallucinations, I assume you mean, and then I remember
Yeah, hallucinations or inaccuracies,
yeah,
those type of things.
I remember the first time we were on a call talking about this, you had me Google, ho what was it? How do you make a balloon dog?
How you make a
Or
balloon
how you
dog,
not
yeah.
Google, how do you make a balloon animal, put that and, like, the it was just not very clear, and so you mean I assume you mean some things like that as well, where it's not
Yeah,
clear, what have you, or it doesn't actually give you an answer.
yeah. So, I mean, right now, I don't think the US is willing to accept a lot of uncertainty in performance
Mhm.
from its weapon systems.
Yeah,
However, if you look at Ukraine, right, they're actively being bombed in their homeland. They're willing to accept more risk, and they are putting AI in drones, and that is causing some transformation.
interesting. Mhm.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
I think it is like a depends on, our how much risk we're willing to accept and
Mhm.
uncertainty. And, I think right now it's not real high.
Yeah.
We're willing to take the time to mature the AI systems
Mhm.
before we start putting them in.
Yeah, some of the areas that I personally always think about when I think about military operations, and frankly, I think one of the ones that, to your point, most people overlook, but is really the mark of any truly elite professional military is logistics, right?
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
Logistics is huge because it doesn't, you think about the United States over the last call it the last 100 years, right? When in World War II, we were fighting essentially a war on two fronts with
Mm,
different logistical needs, millions of men and women deployed, and having to not only, get them to where they need to go, but need to get all the stuff that they need to where they need to go, whether it's bandages or food or weapons or ammunition, and then you think about like the Berlin was it the Berlin airdrop during the at like the start of the Cold War
mhm,
when the Soviets shut down road access into the parts of West Berlin that the Allies had as our power as our part of it. Uh, and then we just decided to start supplying the whole city by air for a while. And when you start thinking about doing that, or like, I'm an ancient history fan as well. When you think about ancient military history and the ability to that some of these ancient states had to supply 80 or 100,000 people
yeah.
1,000 miles away from where they're based and keep them fed and showing up with things and stuff ready to fight. Like that's a level of sophistication that sets states apart historically. And so I think like I don't know, but I think like logistics is a great place for things like that. From a tagging and tracking potentially, but I'm not sure.
No, I think logistics is huge. Predictive maintenance, I mean,
Mhm,
I think that's a low-hanging fruit, so that we know when to repair before they break, but get closer to that fine line of, getting the most service out of things, have the right number of repair parts around.
inventory.
Those are huge in increasing the availability of systems.
Mhm,
So that's a big impact. I mean, we know that logistics has had and AI has had impact in logistics now, like with Amazon, right? And being able to deliver. Um, so I expect logistics, strategic planning on where to send things,
mhm,
where to place things, how to resource things. But those are like the boring things, and people that people don't like to talk about. They want to talk about weapon systems that
mhm.
I don't know do some funky new detection. But I think it's the boring things that tend to have the impact.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
I think that those are also great. I think intel analysis and intel gathering is also a huge area of opportunity. for to automate some of the more manual tasks, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's looking, there's computer vision and reviewing thousands and thousands of images from satellites. But you're right, like it's not the quote unquote the sexy stuff that like everybody's out here like, ooh, this new gun, this, that, but it's like that new gun is not going to do anything if it has no bullets or repair
Yeah.
parts or, you know, gets to the wrong place at the wrong time, right? So,
I I also tend to think back, I tend to look at analogies and pull on my past experiences. I so when I, supported DOT&E, I did a lot of work on radars. And the first radar systems, right, it was just a little circle and a little beep that
hmm
updated once every minute. And you move from that, and then we started learning how to build tracks off the beeps. Then we started learning how to use algorithms to differentiate the targets of interest versus birds. And
right.
then we learned actually how to differentiate between good guys and bad guys. But every time we did that, all we really did was increase the ability for the operators to do more and do more better.
hmm
So we have, I think AI really what that's going to do is it's going to increase the ability for the warfighter and for those systems supporting the warfighter to do more and do more better.
It's fascinating. No, I really appreciate that. And obviously with military and AI, but not just in just the military. I know that I mean there's a lot of risk, right? And there's a lot of safety concerns that are looked at and some that are not looked at well enough. What are some of the ones that you see that should have a bigger priority, you think, or just, whether it's gaps of places, just aspects that are overlooked within safety within AI. What do you think? What are some of those?
So if we move away from like the military and just think in general,
Mhm.
right? Because I guess I'll pause here and I will make a plug for the military. I mean, people think that like I just want people to be aware that DoD has active work into trying to make AI safely.
Mhm.
They're not just going along blindly. They fund research and they're developing test processes. But my plug is done. And then now I will go on to kind of like where I think AI safety, trustworthiness, security, responsible AI,
Mhm.
where maybe they're missing some things. Um, and one of the things you'll notice is like I tend to say these four things: trustworthy, safe, secure, responsible. And that's because those words are often used to focus the conversations on just one aspect of making uh, AI that we want to use. And I think that's one of the things we tend to have people that segment and
Mhm.
really focus on one part. Um, I think that for one thing, I think people don't think enough about kind of like the parts of operational testing that you need to look at what is the actual end goal and end use and who's
Mhm.
going to be using it. They really just focus on like the model.
Mhm.
And the you can have a model that on itself performs well, but once you put it into the large system, you have this AI enabled system and you have it performing a specific task, it could be very different.
Mhm.
Um, so I think there's that. And now I have to pull up my notes. Make
Mhm.
sure I get sorry.
All good. I totally understand.
You totally understand.
Better than
Uh,
100%.
the other thing is that um, when we talk about making a trustworthy and safe AI, we
Mhm.
actually have to think about the safe and the unsafe user kind of separately because they need different processes and policies and assessments. They're just so different. They behave differently. You can almost think of them as different users in different operational conditions. And this is kind of fed by my experience analyzing the financial data, right? We have different processes for the safe user and unsafe user. And actually, we see this everywhere. We have different protections for cars, different processes for everything for the trusted safe user or the trusted user and the untrusted user. I think the other thing is parts of the AI community are talking about the dangers of homogenization, of cultural homogenization, of sameness that may come from AI. And there are parts of the AI community talking about that, but I don't think the larger AI community is talking about it too much.
Mhm. So
Yeah.
what can you as can you define what you mean by that for folks?
Mm.
Um,
That's fair because homogenization, that's one of my material science words.
there you go. Yeah, but like it's also specific to AI. To your point, it's not something that people are talking
Mm,
about at large, right? People,
yeah.
and I know I misunderstood what you meant when we first talked about it. So can you like at a high level define what it is, right? Define the problem for folks and explain why it's an issue.
So homogenization is you have a homogeneous material when it looks basically the same everywhere.
Hmm.
So, um, you know, if you were to go and step into a room with diffuse gray lighting and you couldn't see the walls, it would look very homogeneous. But
Hmm.
most of us don't actually want to live in this environment where everything's the same. We
Hmm.
actually want variety. And our world right now has a chunk of variety. But if we have a place where we have AI that kind of presents and is designed, and it just is going to present one kind of view of the world
Hmm.
and just represent one culture very prominently, and that's dominating everywhere in the world,
Hmm.
then we're going to lose some of that variety that's out there in the world potentially.
Hmm.
Did I
So
say it well? Or
no, I completely understand. So the issue with cultural homogenization is that Um, just to be super blunt about it, many of the models are, and many of AI startups are here in the United States, right?
yeah.
Um, how people interact, like, and we have a very different worldview than folks who live in, say, Southeast Asia,
Mm.
or in the Middle East, largely, or in Africa, and so they the AI models will interact presently with them, folks elsewhere, the same as it will with us. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it also the results it tends to output, it will be like the same with the world, and the results that it tends to output tends to be kind of moving towards some sort of norm that's or kind of commonality that's in its training data. Uh, like I made some sort of LinkedIn post, and I on a whim, I'm like, I told an AI to make me a picture of um, to go with it of a middle-aged female
Mhm,
researcher, and I will tell you, um, despite my prodding, I could not get something outputted for a female that didn't have wasn't very skinny
mhm,
and looked still very young, even if they put gray hair on them, right?
okay,
Because that it just had a problem moving away from that kind of image, kind of single image of a female,
mhm,
because that's what was common in its training data.
okay. So, why and w when you think about the world at large and where we are now,
Mhm.
um, you know, I feel like we, especially in this country, but also in many parts of Europe, are very, very divided as a result of, you know different media and watching different like watching different media, watching different things, having, a non-homogeneous Facebook feed, or
Mm,
Instagram feed. Everything is hyper specialized and focused on you, and you as an individual, right? Not you as a person, Dr.
yeah.
But when you start thinking about that, when you think about hyper specializing AI models to react to you differently, do you think that that would continue to perpetuate and deepen the same problem that we've been having over the last couple of decades, but it's really accelerated over the last 10 years?
That is a really interesting point. So when I was talking about homogenization, I originally was thinking about how we might, because lose some sort of cultural context and
Mhm,
diversity in our AI. But you're also bringing up kind of what might be a micro homogenization, where we find that AIs are kind of trained to just present one view to us. So they may actually have some diversity from person to person, but you as an individual only ever start seeing one perspective.
mhm,
And, you know, from what we can tell from research, that's happening with AI now, right? And I've seen that too. I get, you watch a few too many, one day you're feeling like you need a pick me up and you watch a few too many videos about cats or dogs, and suddenly you can't get the cats and dogs out of your feed for a long time,
1000%.
right?
Mhm,
Um, and that is already impact of AI,
okay,
right? That we're having.
yeah. Because I think that it's very easy to segment people based on how they interact with the world, right? And how you interact
Yeah.
with an AI system and the questions that you ask. But, I also think that now, like, there's a lot of things that AI models, well, the big ones that are out there now. I'm not talking about stuff you pull off of like a Hugging Face and have stored locally. A lot of those things just are not. Um, they are very. They won't answer a lot of questions. They won't do a lot of things,
Mm.
and I think that that also is. I think that could be a representation of the cultural bias of the people that program some of those guidelines and guardrails in place. Or am I right, or do you think that that is?
So you mean like when you get refusals and sometimes what they call false refusals?
Mhm,
That's a hard one, because what we have here is we're kind I see that as an output of trying to make a kind of AI that can be used for all people and in all cases, right? When you try to make something that's safe for everyone, you kind of have to go down to this baseline of okie dokiness
mhm.
that's pretty narrow.
Is that a technical term? Okie dokie.
Yes,
Yes.
okie dokie, and so is peachy keen.
Okay. Okay. I have questions about this from a testing perspective about what the difference is from a measurement perspective.
From the
But I
measurement,
will.
so, I mean, this goes back to what is your use case,
Mhm.
right? And or you mean how I measure okie dokiness?
Yeah, versus peachy
So
keen.
I need the people who are gonna use it to tell me what's okie dokie and what's not okie
Okay.
dokie.
Mhm,
So, on that level, like if we go back to homogenization,
mhm,
if we don't want to have a case where certain cultures are not represented, or a case where there's a variety of female representations in the images I get out of my image generator,
mhm.
then there has to be external pressure
Yeah.
on the developers to
No.
say, yeah.
Mhm, and so what do you think some of the potential impacts of cultural homogenization are within these AI systems?
Oh, I think the one I'm hearing a lot about is also how it can contribute to a cultural divide or a
Mm,
technologic not and a technology gap, right? If if the AIs, if you use them in English, their performance is so much different than you use them in a different language.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, because they're trained on English data. The other thing I've heard about, like the responses you get tend to be a lot more formal sounding, not very realistic.
Mm.
Um, but if they don't have the same capability in other languages, then that's going to, lead to a technology gap. That is definitely concerning some people. Um, some of the other things is you can see like the you could end up with potential discrimination because of the things not being accurately relayed or interpreted. We have like cases in the AI incident database where translators have mistranslated certain comments incorrectly, leading to people getting arrested. Uh,
Interesting.
because they've been seen like as being threatening. So if you have this big gap in capability between languages and cultures, you can end up with discrimination. We can end up with, like you talk about, this people going down rabbit holes and having, you know, um, more separation between people. We can end up with technology gaps. There's um, there's a wide variety of things that could potentially impact what you even see as human liberties and human rights.
Mhm.
This homogenization is something I think the UN has identified as a potential issue, though I think they use a different term for it. They're not material scientists.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, clearly that's their fault. And says a lot about them as an organization. But when you think about uh, so it's because so the models are built in English and trained on English data. Is that a function of where they're built, or availability of training data in other languages, or like training and tag data? It's, to your point about let's organized and cat in is it that, or is it, and then is it largely that they are, does it the answers in other languages, are they like originally written in English and then translated, or I'm just kind of where's the break now, and how could we address some of that?
So it varies. There are some like Mistral, I believe that was developed in Europe, and I believe France. Someone's going to uh, call me out on being wrong at some point. So there are definitely models being built in other languages.
Mhm.
They are not as big or as powerful or as capable, though, as the ones being built currently by the major US players.
Or as well funded?
They're, yeah,
Mhm.
they're being dominated um, because they're dominating because of their compute power and resources they're getting, and because of the amount of training data they have and their investment in training data. Right? Let's not. It's not just the amount; it's the gathering and the cleaning, and they've put resources into that. So that, yeah, that has dominated, and I assume that the reason why the other languages often sound so formal is because they're training on formal
Mm.
content, right?
Mhm. So it goes back to availability, and
Availability, the type of data they have less data, and the data they have, the content tends to speak in a formal tone.
okay. I would assume though that the Chinese are leading in are one of the leaders in this space. Am I
So
wrong?
China is interesting because they do not actively use any of the large Western models, um,
Mhm.
and I don't think they want to be honest, because like when I look, what they consider to be a good model and not a good model is very different, right?
Mhm.
They There's content they do not want their models they use saying, basically.
Interesting. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
that
there's
kind
you
of
can't
culture, right?
nothing anti-communist, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
so,
Yeah,
but
this
our
is
models have no
all
problem.
references to Tiananmen Square off of the
Mhm.
mhm,
Um, they're also fine with biasing certain minority groups within China, right? That's perfectly fine. They also, so they do have their own independent efforts to build models,
okay,
and
okay.
those are coming along. And they also are leaning more heavily in models associated with surveillance.
Yeah, that makes sense. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah, that makes sense considering the nature of their government now, and kind of what they're known for.
yeah.
Not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I do pay attention. So, um, and but so I mean, from when you start thinking about the large models now that are out that are super popular,
Mhm.
the Claudes, the Geminis, the Chat GPTs, they obviously don't have the same restrictions that the Chinese have on theirs, but they have some, right? And so kind of where do you think they are stronger and weaker from a cultural perspective?
Um, Well, I mean, they're trying to respond to the I don't know. Can you from what you mean by cultural perspective?
So that you think about the Chinese models, they only want nothing anti-communist comes out, right?
Mhm.
They don't they have a different level of concern when it comes to biases in referring to folks within certain
Yeah.
populations, per what you said. When you look at like and the chat GPTs, the Geminis, where do you think that the US models are stronger or weaker, and kind of how do you think that those cultural biases are being built into them?
So, I mean, I know there's going to be some cultural biases. If we, I have a colleague that brought up a very, a cultural bias. If you look at like people in India versus people in the U.S.,
Hmm.
people in India will be uncomfortable with content that talks about killing a cow,
Hmm.
or that's the good part. We're fine. We kill cows all the time.
Yep.
So, um,
100%.
yeah. So we would not probably in the U.S. or U.S. Large language models building companies would not censor the
Right.
killing of cows.
Hmm.
Um, that being said, they are trying to navigate this world of how did they build what our culture will consider a safe and secure and trustworthy LLM without always giving refusals to answer things.
Hmm.
And that's not easy because what that means varies from person to person, and
Hmm.
we're not we don't have like some big collective guidance that we're
Yeah.
giving.
Yeah, and it varies year to year, right? Like you think about things that were not okay 20 years ago that are totally
Yeah.
acceptable now. Excuse me, whether it's from a legal perspective or a cultural and societal perspective, that's just a moving target. And like you think about, like I sometimes wonder, like what are the things that we as a society are doing now that we're gonna find abhorrent in 25 years, right?
That's true, but I wanna say this is not unique to AI, right?
Hmm.
Safety and security is always a moving target, so we should just, like, say, "Yes, this is the nature, we're gonna do it for now, and then we'll build on it for later."
Hmm.
I mean, it's not that long ago that there were no seat belts
Yeah,
in cars, let
correct.
alone my parents talk about how when they had a car seat for me, but it was some little like kind of like boingy boingy thing they put on the back of their driver's seat, right? It wasn't belted in. There was like nothing, right? And so we improve and the safety of things constantly.
Hmm.
Side airbags, right? So it's okay to like look here and say, all right, this is where we're starting
Hmm.
and we're going to build from that.
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
don't have to say this is where we're starting. We're never going to do more or better. No, this is where we're starting. We're
Hmm.
going to build.
Okay. Absolutely. And so, how can you I feel like it's a balancing act though, right? When you
Mm,
think about um the two sides, right? There's the moving target of the cultural side that we talked about,
yeah.
and diversity and cultural norms, and having respect for where we are as a culture. But we also need to build we have to have standardized models, right? Where unless I'm wrong, and we don't need to have large standardized models. But where are how do you balance that as a developer?
So I think I think we need so when you say standardized models, to me, it's not very clear. We need to communicate what standards we want the systems to perform to.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean, but those, and then there needs to be like the base, and then what we need for different applications, your base and your delta,
Hmm.
right? We have base for electrical systems. There's some systems have to have a connection to ground, some systems don't. So there's some very basics, but in general, the safety systems we have do depend upon your application you're in use. That's going back to operational, right?
Hmm.
Testing. Even like for cars, we have different requirements for, or let's say, I should say transportation, right? Bikes versus personal vehicles versus semi tractor trailers, right? There's a reason why they have so many tires.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
because failure of one tire then doesn't send things careening off. Um, so developers do have a responsibility, but they cannot carry the full load. We do have to convey to them what they need to do and what is that minimum.
And who should be involved from and I have heard this from a couple of people that there needs to be a very diverse, like we need multiple skill sets involved in this. Outside of the developers, who do you think responsibility for that rests with
Mm.
first? And second, what are some key skill sets that you think should be in the room when companies are having these conversations?
Okay, so who needs to become, so I do think there's a responsibility of the buyers
Hmm.
because they're going to know the use cases. They have to tell them what they need. The government and regulators also have some responsibility.
Hmm.
But you also have to recognize that government and regulators, because when they pass a law, it has to last for a long time, or policy, they're going to, it's made probably not going to be detailed enough. That's really there for the developers. So we need other organizations that help come in and fill in the details. Like
Hmm.
NIST is doing great work, right? It's trying to help fill in the details right now. I would love to see professional organizations stepping up because they're going to know about the details for what is safe and secure and trustworthy for their applications in their fields.
Hmm.
And then if there's other organizations who want to represent different demographics, having them speak is also good. The problem is that how you find all the relevant people, how you bring them into a room,
Hmm.
um, is non-trivial. And even once you bring them in the room, you can't force people to listen to them.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. People need to vote with support people with their wallets. I think that's one of the key ways that this will
Mm.
happen, right? But I think one of the major barriers to that in this world specifically is how much of this is going to be hidden behind, APIs and integrations, and how many corporate dollars are going to flow into it, right?
So, yes. So a lot of it could be hidden behind APIs and integrations, but if we're talking about operational testing,
Hmm.
you can always run the testing out, by calling the API,
Hmm.
right? Uh, you don't have to have access to the black box
Hmm.
and know what it's doing.
Hmm.
And you the you can tell them there's a problem. If you don't know enough about the system you're testing, you can't provide recommendations on what to fix. All you can do is say you have a problem, but that's
Mhm.
at least one thing.
Absolutely. No, I
Mhm.
really appreciate that. As you know, as before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add on this conversation? Any points that we missed? I'm sure there's a lot.
No, I'm good. This has
Okay.
been interesting. Um, hopefully people and you got something out of it. Yeah.
No, I really appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the time today. And you can, Dr. Heather Phrase, thank you for coming on Robust and Red
Thank
Tape.
you.
Thank you.